On January 5, 1972, shortly after Neil Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon, President Richard Nixon presented NASA with $5.5 billion to create a space transportation system, also known as the Space Shuttle, therefore starting the Space Shuttle program. His opening statement was, "I have decided today that the United States should proceed at once with the development of an entirely new type of space transportation designed to help transform the space frontier of the 1970s into familiar territory, easily accessible for human endeavor in the 1980s and 90s. The Space Shuttle program had many charms through the 30 years of service, where the shuttles transported people through space repeatedly, built and repaired multiple satellites, conducted history-changing research, and had a hand in building the International Space Station, the largest structure in space. Throughout all these achievements, however, there are multiple tragedies such as explosions and malfunctions in the spacecraft, resulting in many casualties. The Space Shuttle program moved the idea of going into space forward, as well as making many historic discoveries and missions. Before the Space Shuttle, launching cargo into space was a one-way proposition. Rockets were used to put a tiny capsule carrying astronauts into orbit. Stage by stage, booster segments of the rocket would fall away during the launch as their fuel ran out. The spacecraft would go into orbit around Earth and then would fall back to Earth, plunging into the ocean. At that point, it became space garbage and every part of the vehicle was discarded, never to be used again, with exception of the human crew. In fact, in the 1970s, people had lost interest in space exploration and were more focused on rising social problems, such as racial discrimination and urban unrest, as well as the Vietnam War. After President Nixon pushed the program through in 1972, the supporters of the program hailed the president's decision, arguing that the shuttle would help restore confidence in the country's technological superiority both at home and abroad. Critics, however, blasted the program, saying that the money should be spent instead on needed social programs. From 1981 to 2011, NASA built 5 shuttles: Columbia, Challenger, Discovery, Atlantis, and Endeavour, and they flew 135 missions in total. The first shuttle ever built was called the Enterprise, after the spacecraft in the famous Star Trek television series. The Enterprise was fully functional and well-built, however, NASA did not use it to go to space, but to test the critical phases of landing and other important shuttle aspects. The Columbia shuttle flew its first mission to orbit on April 12, 1981, and in 2 days it orbited the Earth 36 times. At first, Columbia tested the shuttle design to see that it worked, but later deployed satellites and worked as a laboratory in space. The Challenger made its first flight on April 4, 1983, and throughout its 10 missions, the shuttle hosted missions that saw astronauts take the first ever spacewalks with jetpacks, including the first mission to pull a satellite out of orbit, fix it, and return it to service. The Discovery shuttle began its missions in August of 1984 and has flown more than any other shuttle with 39 successful missions. It deployed the Hubble Space Telescope, which changed the perspective of the universe, and it was the first space shuttle retired from NASA's fleet following its STS-133 mission to the International Space Station in February and March of 2011. The Endeavour shuttle was the last space shuttle built and took its first flight in May of 1992. It repaired the Hubble Space Telescope and deployed the Alpha Magnetic Spectrometer as its final mission. The Atlantis shuttle was the 5th operational shuttle and made its first flight on October 3, 1985. The shuttle sent probes to other planets, carried NASA's Destiny laboratory to the International Space Station, and final shuttle servicing mission for NASA's Hubble Space Telescope. Atlantis was the last shuttle to ever fly. Each shuttle of the program helped NASA reach the original goal of flying safely on a reusable spacecraft to improve space transportation. The triumphs of the space transportation systems heavily outweigh the tragedies. Many of them include U.S. space firsts, such as carrying aloft the first African-American male, the first Hispanic astronaut, the first Native American astronaut, the first U.S. female astronaut, as well as the first U.S. female mission commander and pilot. Sally Ride became the first American woman to go into space when she flew on the Challenger on June 18, 1983. She made 2 shuttle flights and later became a champion for science education and a role model for generations. Ride served on the Accident Investigation Board set up in response to the 2 space shuttle tragedies, Challenger in 1986 and Columbia in 2003. Guillaume Bluford was the first African-American male in space who flew 4 shuttle missions. On his first flight, the STS-8, he said, "I laughed all the way up because it was such a fun ride." He later deployed the Indian National Satellite. Many other people became a first to go into space and make history. Another triumph of the Space Shuttle program is how they revolutionized the way people worked in space. Astronauts aboard Space Shuttle missions not only released satellites into orbit, they also captured, repaired, and then redeployed those already in space, the first time that had ever been accomplished. On April 25, 1990, astronauts aboard the Shuttle Discovery deployed the Hubble Space Telescope. Over the next 12 years, 4 more shuttle missions repaired and upgraded the orbiting telescope. 11 Space Shuttle missions also docked with the Mir space station and 16 with the International Space Station, carrying supplies and crew members to and from the stations. Over the course of the Space Shuttle program, there were giant leaps forward in manned spaceflight, but also tragic setbacks like the 2 shuttles that have been lost, Challenger in 1986 and Columbia in 2003. On January 28, 1986, millions of Americans watched as the Challenger space shuttle exploded, just 73 seconds after launching from Cape Canaveral, Florida. The explosion killed all 7 crew members aboard. The shuttle exploded after its fuel tank tore apart and leaked liquid oxygen and hydrogen, causing a massive fireball to form at an altitude of 46,000 feet. The Challenger explosion had sobered the space agency, prompting hundreds of design and procedural changes costing $2.4 billion. The agency devoted the shuttle almost exclusively to delivering defense and scientific payloads. The space program, a symbol of U.S. exceptionalism, continued to receive substantial, if less enthusiastic, support from the public. On February 1, 2003, the Space Shuttle Columbia also exploded, but this time it happened just 16 minutes before its scheduled landing. Again, all 7 crew members, 5 men and 2 women, perished. The cause of that accident was damage to the left wing when a piece of foam from an external tank hit it upon takeoff. At the launch, this occurrence was not considered a safety concern. After the period of mourning for the lost space adventurers passed, questions remained about the shuttle's record, about the ways that the poor management at NASA might have jeopardized the astronauts' safety, and about the future of manned spaceflight in general. The loss of the Columbia differed from the loss of the Challenger because Americans started to believe that NASA is not fit to transport astronauts safely into space and back. Between the 2 tragedies, 14 astronauts perished in total, and both disasters left NASA reeling and searching for stability, respect, and direction. The subsequent investigations into the disasters scolded NASA for its emphasis on style over science and safety, as well as NASA's management style. The organization was ill-prepared to fend off such attacks that tarnished its image. After the Challenger explosion, another shuttle did not fly for more than 2 years. After Columbia's doomed flight, it was expected that another shuttle would not fly until at least the spring of 2005. I got the chance to talk with Joe Brofman about the impact of the space shuttle. Joe has an electrical engineering background and has been engaged at all levels within small and large companies working with almost all aspects of the aerospace industry.
Before shuttle existed, space transportation was basically rockets. Shuttle did a lot, I think, to enhance manned space. There were then, and there still are, massive debates about, should we be, using people in space, or should we just use robotics and wait until it's easier, to do the things you need to do to make it safe for people to go. By its name, it was really intended to give us a continuing platform in space. It wasn't just go to the moon, look around, come back, bring some rocks back, see if you can live and do this and do that. It was really, we're going to go and we're going to come back and we're going to do this on a regular basis, and we're going to put people in space. I mean, today we have people living in space. They wouldn't be living there. That wouldn't even be a thought yet without something like the shuttle to make it easy to go back and forth.
When the Space Shuttle Atlantis landed at the Kennedy Space Center on July 21, 2011, it marked the conclusion of the final shuttle mission and the end to a 30-year era of shuttle flights. The program ended because the shuttle never met its promise for low-cost access to space by virtue of the system's reusability. Now there are new developments that correspond with NASA's budget, but it will be some time before they get into space using that type of spacecraft. Starting with the first built shuttle, the Enterprise, and ending with the Atlantis, the space transportation system proved to be very successful despite its two major disasters.